an unforgettable story of survival and hope. For years, he was forgotten, chained, starving, barely surviving. No one stopped, no one cared, until one woman saw him. In that moment, everything changed. This is a story of survival, hope, and the power of love. Stay with us. You won't forget what happens next. The world beyond the fence was full of life. Milo could hear it every day, children laughing, car doors slamming, footsteps echoing against pavement. He could hear voices, lighthearted and warm, drifting through the wind like melodies from another world. A world he had once been a part of. But that world no longer belonged to him. Milo lay in the dirt, his body curled into itself in the farthest corner of the yard. The ground beneath him was hard and cracked, devoid of grass or warmth. Trash littered the space, rusted metal scraps, broken furniture, discarded bottles. The stench of decay clung to the air, thick and suffocating. And then there was the chain. Thick, rusted, and unyielding, it wrapped around his neck like an iron noose. The weight of it had long since become a part of him, pressing into his skin, carving deep, raw wounds that never truly healed. At first, he had fought against it. He had clawed at the earth, pulling, twisting, biting down on the metal with all the strength he had left. But the chain was stronger than he was. It always was. Over time, the fight drained from him. Milo learned to stop struggling. He learned that no matter how hard he pulled, the chain would never break. He learned that no one was coming. The first few weeks, he had barked at passing cars, at shadows beyond the fence, at the fading sunlight that disappeared behind rooftops. He had called out, pleading for someone, anyone to hear him, but the world never answered. So he stopped barking. Now he barely lifted his head when people walked by. They never stopped, never turned their heads to glance through the gaps in the fence. To them, he was invisible, a forgotten soul in a forgotten place. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a familiar ache that had become his only constant companion. His water bowl sat empty, the metal rim rusting beneath the scorching sun. If it was ever filled, it dried up too quickly. The heat burned his paws in the summer. The cold cut through his bones in the winter. There was no shelter, no blanket, no comfort. But worst of all was the loneliness. Milo had once known love, fingers running through his fur, a voice calling his name with affection. He had once belonged to someone, but those memories were distant now, like faded dreams slipping through the cracks of his mind. He still remembered the day his world had changed, the moment the door had closed behind him, the way the leash had been removed from his collar and replaced with something far heavier. He had waited for days, weeks. He had waited for the door to open again, for familiar hands to reach for him, to take him inside where it was warm, where he could curl up at someone's feet and fall asleep to the sound of a beating heart. But the door never opened, and eventually he stopped waiting. Now all he had was the fence, the thin, broken slats of wood that separated him from the world beyond. Some nights he would press his paws against the ground, stretching as far as the chain would allow, peering through the cracks just to see something different. A car's headlights sweeping across the pavement, a person walking by with their dog, the leash loose in their hands, their pet wagging its tail without a care in the world. Milo would watch them until they disappeared, until the street was silent again. Then he would close his eyes and dream of things he no longer believed in, of hands that held him, of voices that called his name, of love that had once been his. But when he woke, the chain was still there, and he was still alone. Claire had passed this street 100 times before. It was a quiet, unremarkable neighborhood, rows of small, aging houses, cracked sidewalks, and fences that sagged under years of neglect. She had never paid much attention to the worn-down yards or the rusted gates. It was just another street in another part of town. But today, something caught her eye. A shadow moved behind a broken fence, just a flicker, barely noticeable. At first, she thought it was the wind stirring the dry grass. But then she saw them, two paws, thin and caked in dirt, stretching out from beneath the fence as if reaching for something, for someone. Claire stopped. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she stepped closer, peering through a gap in the wooden slats. And then she saw him. The breath caught in her throat. A dog, no, not just a dog, but a ghost of one. His body was skeletal, ribs pressing against dull, matted fur. Patches of his coat were missing, exposing raw skin beneath. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now sunken and clouded with exhaustion. He wasn't barking, he wasn't growling, he wasn't even moving. He was just staring at her. For a long moment, Claire couldn't move. She felt frozen, trapped between shock and heartbreak. The world around her blurred, the sound of passing cars, the rustling of leaves in the wind. Everything faded except for those eyes, pleading, empty, lost. What was he thinking? Had he already given up? Her heart twisted painfully in her chest. She swallowed hard and slowly, cautiously, lowered herself to her knees, pressing her hands against the fence. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Can you hear me?" The dog didn't react right away. He simply blinked, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of her voice. She hesitated, then carefully extended her hand through the gap in the fence. She kept her movements slow, gentle, making sure not to startle him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, ever so hesitantly, he moved. Not much, just the slightest shift of his head, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air between them. His body trembled as if the simple motion took all the strength he had left. Claire held her breath, waiting, and then, so softly that she almost didn't feel it, his tongue flicked out just once, barely grazing the tip of her fingers. A single touch, weak, tentative, but it was enough to shatter her. Claire's vision blurred as tears stung the corners of her eyes. This dog, this forgotten, broken soul, had every reason to fear her, to flinch away, to retreat into the only world he had ever known. But he hadn't. Even after everything, he still wanted love. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to breathe, to blink away the sting behind her eyes. She looked around, searching for any sign of movement, anyone who might claim this dog as theirs. Nothing. The house behind the fence was dark, its windows clouded with dust and grime. The yard was littered with rusted tools and old tires, forgotten like the animal that lay among them. "Who did this to you?" she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The dog didn't answer, of course, but he didn't look away either. Claire exhaled shakily, her mind racing. She had no idea what to do. This wasn't a stray wandering the streets. He was trapped, chained, abandoned. She couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after he had reached for her. Her fingers curled into fists against the fence. She had to do something. Claire's heart pounded against her ribs as she knelt beside the fence, staring at the Yace who had just licked her fingers with the last ounce of trust he had left. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. All she could do was look at him and feel the crushing weight of reality settle on her chest like a stone. How long had he been like this? How many people had walked past this very spot, just as she had so many times before, without ever noticing him? Or worse, had they noticed and simply chosen to ignore him? Claire's fingers trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket. There had to be someone who could help. An animal rescue, a shelter, a hotline, someone. She quickly typed in the number for the nearest animal rescue and pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. She bit her lip, ending the call and immediately dialing another number. Her stomach clenched as she listened to the hollow ring on the other end. Still nothing. Her pulse quickened. She tried again, this time calling the local Humane Society. The line rang for what felt like an eternity before a robotic voice answered. "We're sorry. All of our representatives are currently assisting other callers. Please leave a message and we'll return your call as soon as possible." A message? A message? Claire's hand tightened around her phone. How much longer could this dog wait? How many more days, weeks, or months had he already suffered? The way he lay there, so still, so resigned, made it clear he had already stopped believing anyone was coming. But Claire was here, and she had a choice to make. She could stand up, brush the dirt from her jeans, and walk away like everyone else had. She could convince herself that someone else would help, that it wasn't her responsibility. Or she could do something. She could be the person who didn't walk away. Her chest tightened as she looked down at the dog, this fragile, starving soul who had done nothing but exist in the wrong place, under the wrong hands. His ribs pressed against his thin coat, his breathing slow and shallow. Claire exhaled sharply and shoved her phone back into her pocket. She already knew her answer. She wasn't leaving without him. She scanned the yard, searching for a way in. The wooden gate was locked, of course it was, and the fence, though worn and broken in places, was still too tall to climb without making noise. If whoever owned this house was inside, she couldn't risk alerting them before she got to the dog. Her eyes darted along the perimeter, and then she saw it. Near the back of the fence, several planks had rotted away, leaving a small gap near the ground. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Without hesitating, Claire dropped to her knees and crawled forward, ignoring the dry grass scratching against her arms. Her heart pounded as she squeezed through the gap, the wood pressing against her back as she wiggled inside. And then suddenly she was in. The yard was even worse up close. The ground was cracked and dry, littered with rusted cans and broken glass. The air smelled of damp wood and something foul, something that made her stomach turn. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was him, the one she now knew she couldn't leave behind. She approached slowly, her hands open, her voice soft. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. "It's okay. I'm here now." His ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't move. Not out of fear, out of exhaustion. She knelt beside him, reaching out carefully. Her fingers brushed against the thick chain locked around his neck, and her stomach twisted at the deep, raw wounds beneath the rusted metal. How could anyone do this? Her hands curled into fists. This wasn't just neglect. This was cruelty. She needed to get him out of here. Now. Her eyes darted around the yard, searching for anything she could use. Her pulse quickened when she spotted a pile of discarded tools near the back porch. A pair of bolt cutters. She didn't stop to think, didn't stop to consider what would happen if someone caught her. She just moved. Claire ran toward the tools, grabbing the bolt cutters with shaky hands. Her fingers were slick with sweat as she hurried back to the dog, positioning the blades around the thickest part of the chain. Her breath came fast. Her hands shook. And then, she squeezed the handles. A sharp, metallic snap rang through the air. The chain fell away. For the first time in what must have been years, Milo was free. But he didn't run. He didn't move at all. Instead, his body swayed. His legs trembled. And then, he collapsed. Claire barely caught him before he hit the ground. Panic surged through her veins as she cradled his frail body, his head resting against her lap. His breathing was shallow, his muscles limp. No, she whispered, brushing his fur with trembling hands. "Come on, buddy. Stay with me." She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. This wasn't over. Not yet. She had gotten him this far, and she would not let him go now. Claire pulled out her phone with one hand, her other arm still wrapped protectively around him. This time, she wasn't calling a shelter. She was calling the police. Claire's heart pounded as she crouched beside the fence, her fingers brushing against the splintered wood. She could barely see through the narrow gaps, but she knew he was still there. Milo was waiting, though she wasn't sure if he even knew he was waiting anymore. She ran her hands along the worn planks, searching. The fence was old, its wood rotting in places, and then, there, a small opening near the ground, just big enough for her to squeeze through if she lay flat. She hesitated for only a second. Then she dropped to her knees, pressed her palms into the dirt, and slid forward. The world inside the fence was worse than she had imagined. The air smelled of decay and neglect, a mixture of rust, dried blood, and something deeper, something that made her stomach twist with unease. The ground beneath her palms was dry and cracked, littered with broken glass and old scraps of metal. And then she saw him. For the first time, without the barrier between them, she saw all of him. Milo was lying on his side, his body barely more than bones wrapped in a tattered coat of fur. His ribs jutted out beneath his thin skin, each breath slow and labored. His legs were folded awkwardly beneath him, trembling even though he wasn't moving. But it was his neck that made her chest tighten with rage. The chain, thick, rusted, and far too tight, dug deep into his flesh, leaving behind angry red wounds. Some were old, the skin scarred and hardened around the metal, but others were fresh, raw, still seeping where the rust had cut through. Claire's hands curled into fists. How long had he suffered like this? She forced herself to take a slow breath, to push back the fury that burned in her chest. Anger wouldn't help him right now. He needed her to be calm. Slowly, she lowered herself to his level, her voice soft and steady. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. "I'm here now." Milo didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just stared at her with those sunken, hollow eyes, as if he didn't believe she was real. Claire swallowed past the lump in her throat. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from his face. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said gently. "I promise." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, barely, just barely, his ears flicked. It was the smallest reaction, but it was something. Encouraged, she let her hand rest lightly on the dirt beside him, giving him time to decide. Milo's nose twitched. He sniffed the air between them, hesitant, cautious. His body remained still, but his breathing changed, just slightly, just enough for her to know he was aware of her, that he was trying to understand. Claire exhaled slowly. "Good boy," she murmured. She let her eyes drift back to the chain, bile rising in her throat at the sight of it. She had to get it off him. Carefully, she reached for the rusted metal, her fingers ghosting over the links. It was thick, far too heavy for a dog his size. She tried to slip her fingers beneath it, but there was no space. It was too tight, buried too deep into his skin. Claire bit her lip, frustration rising. She tried again, wiggling the metal slightly, hoping to find a weak spot, but it wouldn't budge. The pressure must have caused Milo pain, because he let out a soft, broken whimper. Claire's chest constricted. "Shh," she soothed immediately, pulling her hands back. I'm sorry." She looked around desperately. There had to be something, anything she could use. Her gaze landed on a pile of old tools near the back of the yard, discarded and forgotten. And there, half buried in the dirt, was a pair of bolt cutters. Claire's pulse quickened. This was it. This was how she would free him. She didn't know if she was allowed to do this. She didn't know if she was trespassing, if someone would come storming out of the house to scream at her. But she didn't care. She would not leave this yard without him. Not tonight, not ever. The air was thick with the scent of rust and neglect, the quiet of the night broken only by the faint rasp of Milo's breath. Claire's fingers trembled as she sifted through the pile of discarded tools, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it drowned out the world around her. Then her hand closed around cold metal, the bolt cutters. She yanked them free, gripping them so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her pulse quickened as she turned back to Milo. He hadn't moved. He was still lying in the dirt, ribs pressing against his thin skin, his sunken eyes barely tracking her movements. Claire swallowed hard. She had never seen a dog so utterly defeated, but that was about to change. She dropped to her knees beside him, positioning the blades of the bolt cutters around the thickest part of the chain wrapped around his neck. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to steady them. One cut, that was all it would take. She exhaled sharply, bracing herself. "This is it, buddy," she whispered. "You're almost free." Milo didn't react. Claire's fingers tightened around the handles. With one last deep breath, she squeezed. The metal groaned in protest before giving way with a sharp snap. The chain fell away. For the first time in years, Milo was no longer bound. Claire let out a trembling breath, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. She had done it. She had freed him. But then, Milo swayed, his legs trembled, and before she could react, he collapsed. A strangled gasp escaped Claire's lips as she lunged forward, barely catching his frail body before he hit the ground. "Milo!" Her voice cracked as she cradled him, one hand resting against his sunken ribs. His breathing was uneven, his muscles limp against her touch. He wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't there either. His body had given up long ago. His spirit had just been waiting to catch up. Claire's throat tightened as she stroked his fur, her fingers brushing over the raw, tender wounds where the chain had dug into his skin. He should have run. He should have wagged his tail, barked, done something to show that he understood what had just happened. But instead, he had collapsed beneath the weight of his own freedom. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. He didn't know what to do without the chain. For so long, it had been a part of him. His world had been measured by its length, his life dictated by its pull. Even when it hurt, even when it stole his strength, At least it had been constant, and now it was gone. A choked sob escaped Claire as she lowered her forehead against his. "You're okay," she whispered. "I've got you. You're free now. You're safe." But Milo didn't react. A single tear slipped down Claire's cheek, landing softly in his fur. She clenched her jaw, forcing back the sobs, threatening to break her apart. No, he wasn't giving up. Not now. She wiped at her eyes, her hands tightening around him protectively. He had made it this far. She wouldn't let this be the end of his story. With renewed determination, Claire pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. This time, she wasn't calling an animal shelter. She was calling for help, because Milo was finally free, and she would make sure he lived to understand what that meant. Claire cradled Milo's frail body in her arms, his weight shockingly light, too light. His breathing was shallow, each exhale a ghost of what it should have been. His fur, once meant to be thick and strong, now barely clung to his skin, his ribs pressing sharply against it like brittle branches in the winter. She could feel the heat radiating from him. A fever. His body was fighting, but he was losing. Claire tightened her grip and hurried toward her car, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hold on, buddy," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "Just hold on a little longer." She reached her car and gently laid him across the back seat, arranging a blanket beneath his frail frame. He didn't react, not to the movement, not to the sound of the door shutting, not to the gentle stroke of her fingers against his head. Her chest constricted with fear. He was slipping away. Claire jumped into the driver's seat and fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. Then, with a sharp twist, the engine roared to life. She pressed her foot to the gas. The road blurred beneath her tires as she sped toward the nearest animal clinic, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. She stole quick glances in the rearview mirror, watching Milo's small chest rise and fall, counting each breath as if sheer willpower could keep him tethered to life. "Don't you dare leave me now," she thought desperately. "Not when you're finally free." The clinic's neon sign glowed faintly in the distance, a beacon in the night. Claire swerved into the parking lot, barely stopping the car before throwing the door open. She yanked the back door open and gathered Milo into her arms again. His body was limp, his head lolling against her chest. "No, he's still breathing. He's still here." Claire burst through the clinic doors, her voice sharp with urgency. "I need help. He's in bad shape." A vet technician looked up, eyes widening at the sight of Milo in her arms. Within seconds, a small team was rushing toward her, guiding her to an examination table. She carefully set him down, her hands reluctant to let go. The lead vet, a middle-aged man with tired but kind eyes, moved in immediately. "What happened?" he asked as he pressed his stethoscope against Milo's frail chest. Claire swallowed hard, her throat raw. "He was chained up outside for years, I think. No food, barely any water. The chain was so tight." Her voice cracked. "It cut into his skin." The vet nodded grimly, his fingers carefully pressing along Milo's bony frame. "He's extremely malnourished," he murmured, "severely dehydrated, and..." He pulled back the fur around Milo's neck, revealing the deep infected wounds. The chain did a lot of damage. Claire's stomach churned at the sight. The metal had not just rubbed against his skin, it had become a part of him, embedded into his flesh like a cruel collar of rust and pain. The vet turned to a nurse. "Get fluids started. IV drip, antibiotics immediately." Claire stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She felt so helpless. All she could do was watch as they worked, placing an IV in his frail leg, swabbing the infected wounds, pressing a stethoscope against his chest over and over, as if afraid his heartbeat would suddenly vanish. Then finally, "He's weak," the vet said, "but he's fighting." Claire let out a shaky breath, her vision blurring with relief. "Will he make it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The vet hesitated, then met her gaze. "With time and care, yes, he has a chance, a real chance." Claire staggered forward, reaching out to place a trembling hand on Milo's head. His fur was coarse beneath her fingertips, his body still too fragile, too broken. But he was here, he was alive, and for the first time since she had found him, his eyes opened just a little. Claire swallowed past the lump in her throat and leaned down, her lips barely an inch from his ear. "You're safe now, Milo," she whispered, Everything's gonna be okay. Milo lay motionless on the soft blanket, his frail body barely making an imprint on the fabric. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of medical machines. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold glow over the room, but beneath them he was warm, for the first time in years. But he didn't understand it. His world had been chains and dirt, hunger and cold. Now there was something soft beneath him, something that didn't dig into his bones. His neck was light, free from the weight that had once strangled him. His body no longer ached with the constant pull of metal against skin. Yet he couldn't move, not because of pain, though pain was still there, lingering in the deepest parts of him, but because he didn't know how. What did freedom feel like? He had been trapped for so long that he had forgotten. The voices around him were kind, soft murmurs from the people who moved around his bed, checking his wounds, stroking his fur. But he didn't react. He just lay there, listening. Then one day a voice broke through the haze, a voice he knew. "Hey, buddy," Claire whispered as she sat beside him. "It's me." Something in him stirred. The sound of her voice, gentle, familiar, touched a part of him that had been buried beneath years of silence. But he didn't move. Claire sighed softly, brushing her fingers against his paw. "I know you're tired, but I'm here, okay? I'll be here every day." And she was. The next day she came again. She sat beside him for hours, telling him about her day, about the weather, about anything, just so he wouldn't feel alone. She read to him from her book, her voice filling the quiet room. She played soft music, hoping the sound would soothe him. And then, on the third day, everything changed. The door creaked open, and Claire stepped inside, her footsteps light as she crossed the room. Milo heard her, and for the first time, he lifted his head. It was only by a few inches, only for a moment, but it was enough. Claire's breath hitched. "Oh my God," she whispered, rushing to his side. "Milo, you..." She choked on the words, laughter and tears mixing in her voice. "You looked at me." Milo blinked slowly, exhaustion still weighing heavily on him. But his eyes, those tired, defeated eyes, held something new. Recognition, trust, a tiny flicker of hope. Claire swallowed back the lump in her throat and reached for his paw, wrapping her fingers around it. "You're doing so good," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew you could do it." Milo let his head drop back down, his body still too weak to hold himself up for long. But Claire didn't care. It was a start, and for the first time, she believed, really believed, that he was going to make it. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the clinic windows, painting the sterile white walls with warmth. Claire stepped through the door, the familiar scent of antiseptic filling her lungs. She had memorized this place, the quiet beeping of machines, the hushed conversations of veterinarians, the rhythmic sound of her own footsteps against the linoleum floor. But today, something was different. She could feel it in the air, a shift, a stirring. And then she saw him. Milo was standing. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. He was unsteady, his legs trembling beneath him, but he was on his feet. The blanket he had been curled up on for days lay crumpled behind him, abandoned. His frail body, still too thin, still too weak, quivered under the weight of his own limbs. But he was trying. And then, with excruciating slowness, he took a step. Claire's hands flew to her mouth as tears burned behind her eyes. Another step, and another. His legs wobbled dangerously, but he refused to fall. He moved with hesitation, with uncertainty, but also with determination, as if something deep inside him had finally woken up, whispering, "Keep going." And then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, his eyes locked onto hers. He was walking to her. A sob broke from Claire's lips. She dropped to her knees, her arms open, her entire body trembling with emotion. "Milo," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, just for a moment. His ears twitched at the sound of her voice, his gaze flickering with something she had never seen before. Recognition. And then, in a movement so small, so fragile that it might have gone unnoticed if she weren't watching so closely, his tail wagged. Not much, just a flicker, a tiny hesitant sway, but it was there. It was real. Claire let out a laugh, wet, shaky, half sob, half joy, as Milo reached her and with what little strength he had left, pressed his head against her chest. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur, her tears slipping silently into the matted coat. "You did it," she whispered. "You did it, buddy." Milo didn't respond. He just stood there, leaning into her, letting himself be held. And for the first time, Claire knew he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The world outside the clinic smelled of fresh air and warm pavement, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of antiseptic that had lingered around Milo for weeks. Claire stood just outside the doors, her hands gripping the adoption papers, her heart pounding in her chest. It was official. Milo was hers. She had known the moment the rescue center mentioned finding him a home that she couldn't let him go. The thought of someone else taking him, someone who hadn't sat beside him in the quiet hours, who hadn't whispered to him in the dark, who hadn't watched him fight to take his first real steps toward life again. It was unthinkable. Milo had fought for survival. Now Claire would fight for him. She glanced down at the fragile yet resilient creature sitting beside her. His body was still too thin, his fur still patchy, but there was a light in his eyes now, a quiet kind of trust. His leash hung loosely in her hand, but he made no effort to pull away. He was waiting for her. Claire knelt, cupping his face gently in her hands. "You're coming home with me," she whispered. Milo blinked up at her, his tired eyes searching hers, and then, so softly, so tentatively, his tail wagged. The drive home was quiet. Milo sat curled in the passenger seat, his body still, his breathing steady. Claire stole glances at him, her heart aching at how small he looked out against the vastness of the car. She wondered if he understood. Did he know he wasn't going back, that the cold nights on hard dirt were over, that no one would ever chain him again? She reached over, resting a hand gently on his head as she whispered, "Almost there, buddy." The car pulled into her driveway, and for a moment Claire just sat there, staring at her house. It wasn't anything grand, just a modest little home, cozy, quiet. But to Milo, it would be everything. She stepped out, walking around to the passenger side. Opening the door, she knelt beside him. "Ready?" she asked. Milo didn't move at first. His ears flicked at her voice, his gaze shifting from her to the open world outside. A new place, a new life. For a second, she thought he might be too scared to step out. Then, with a slow, cautious movement, he lifted his paw over the edge of the seat. Claire swallowed back a sob as he took his first step into his new home. Milo's first night was quiet. He sniffed at the furniture, at the soft blankets Claire had laid out for him, at the toys she wasn't sure he even knew how to play with. He padded slowly from room to room, his nose pressed against the walls, as if trying to map out this strange, unfamiliar world. Claire gave him space, letting him explore. She watched from the doorway as he wandered into the living room, pausing by the couch. He sniffed at it, then at the rug, then at the small bed she had placed beside it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked straight to her, her breath hitched as he stopped at her feet, his tired legs folding beneath him. And just like that, he lay down beside her. Not in the bed she had bought, not on the couch. Right there, against her feet, as if he had chosen her as his resting place. Claire's chest tightened as she sank to her knees, running her fingers gently through his fur. He exhaled softly, pressing his head into her touch. "Welcome home, Milo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Milo let out a deep, contented sigh. For the first time in his life, he belonged. The seasons had shifted. The bitter cold of winter had given way to the warmth of spring, and with it, the quiet miracle of transformation. Milo was no longer the fragile, broken soul Claire had found behind that fence. His ribs no longer protruded beneath his fur. The once dull, matted patches had grown into a thick, soft coat. His eyes, which had once held only emptiness, now shone with quiet curiosity, with trust, with life. Every morning, Claire woke up to the soft sound of paws against the wooden floor. Milo would wait by the door, tail wagging, leash dangling in his mouth. His way of telling her, "Let's go explore the world together." And every evening, he would curl up beside her, his head resting against her lap as she read, as if he had always belonged there. He had learned to love walks, the feeling of grass beneath his paws, the wind against his face. At first, he had been cautious, hesitant to step beyond the small world he had come to trust. But little by little, he had discovered that the world was not just a place of chains and loneliness. It was a place of warmth, of kindness, of second chances. And one evening, as the golden light of sunset filtered through the window, Claire caught a glimpse of something that made her stop in her tracks. Milo was standing by the window staring outside. His ears were perked, his body still. His eyes followed the people walking along the sidewalk, the passing cars, the birds flitting across the sky. But there was no longing in his gaze, no sadness, no desperation, just quiet wonder. As if he was finally seeing the world not as something beyond his reach, but as something that was his to explore. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat, watching him with a mix of awe and gratitude. Milo had come so far, and so had she. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms gently around his neck. He turned, pressing his head against her shoulder in that way he always did when he felt safe. She smiled, blinking away the tears. "Milo," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Look at you." His tail wagged softly, as if he understood. She pressed a kiss to the top of his head and murmured, "You're home." And for the first time in both their lives, they truly were. Milo's story is not just about survival. It's about the power of kindness, the strength of second chances, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Every day, countless animals like Milo wait in silence, longing for someone to see them, to care, to act. They don't need pity, they need hope. And hope begins with us. If you've ever looked into the eyes of an animal and seen a soul longing for love, then you already understand they deserve better. So today, let this be more than just a story. Let it be a reminder that each of us has the power to change a life. Be the reason a life changes today. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with those who believe in rescue and rehabilitation. Every animal deserves a home. Be the reason a life changes today.